Hi, welcome to session one of the fourth topic of the semester titled The Texas Revolution of 1836. Now, this is session one, and we're going to now start this topic by looking at the table of contents first, just look at what we're going to cover, and then we're going to proceed to move into the first part, if you will. Okay, so let me share the screen here. All right, it is all right, it's available already. Okay, so this is the Texas Revolution. We're moving now into the second part of the course, the second part of the semester. That is going to look at Texas history now from independence, nationhood, and eventually statehood and civil war. Okay, so the time period we're going to be looking at in this second part of the semester is from 1836 all the way to 1877. And the first topic that we're going to cover, which is this, the fourth topic, is the Texas Revolution, independence itself. This is the time when Texas is going to declare independence from Mexico and, of course, create an independent state, an independent republic, an independent nation. Something we're going to get to see in the fifth topic, of course, Texas as a republic. Now, in this topic, we're just going to cover the independence movement itself, what is called the Texas Revolution, and the way we're going to approach this topic, as the table of contents show, is that there will be three main parts to it. The very first part is going to look at the Texas Revolution in the age of revolutions. In other words, the very first part that we're going to cover in this session is going to place the historical perspective, the historical background of the Texas Revolution as part of a series of revolutions that had been occurring since the 1600s. You know, the Texas Revolution was just part of those waves of revolutionary movements, revolutionary upheavals that took place in Europe and also in North America, in the United States, that is to say. The Texas Revolution was connected to those series of movements, if you will, something we're going to get to see and explore in this session. Now, part two is going to look at the more immediate causes and origins of the Texas Revolution, how the Texas Revolution originated, that is to say. So we're going to have to make connections with the politics of Mexico, Mexico City being the capital of Mexico, and the relationship between Mexico and Texas, and how those relationships developed tensions to the point of rupture in 1836. We're going to cover that in great depth. Now, part three is going to look at the war for independence, the Texas War for Independence itself. That is to say, now the revolution breaks out in 1836, and we're going to see not so much the military aspects of the revolution, but rather just the major developments that occurred during this time. Mainly the invasion of Texas by Santa Anna's army. President Santa Anna, the president of Mexico, will be coming to Texas, invading Texas, and the response, of course, inside of Texas, the different armies or groups that were fighting for independence and so on. The Declaration of Independence of Texas will be looked at as well. what were some of the ideas that the revolutionaries were pursuing, and ultimately how Santa Anna's army will be defeated. Again, all of that will be assessed in part 3. Okay. All right. So now let us move forward and look at part 1, the Texas Revolution in the Age of Revolutions. Okay. This is the very first part that we're going to look at, mainly in this session, session 1. Okay. As I explained just a moment ago, the Texas Revolution was taking place in an atmosphere, in a climate, if you will, of revolutionary upheavals that have been developing ever since the 1600s in Europe, particularly in England. Okay? In other words, if we can trace the lineage of the Texas Revolution back in history and say, okay, so the Texas Revolution adopted some of the principles, some of the ideas, the aspirations of other societies, we can trace the lineage back to England in the 1600s. And of course, events that happen in England in the 1600s will also find an impact in the events unfolding in North America in the British 13 colonies, with the independence of the 13 colonies, the British 13 colonies that formed the United States. So even the United States itself can trace its lineage back to England. The American Independence Revolution of the United States can trace its lineage, if you will, back to the English Revolution of the 1600s. So what this means is that, as will be explained in this session, in this very first part, that the Texas Revolution was part of those upheavals that started in England, continued in North America with the American independence movement, and the same ideas, the same ideals, and even problems that led to those revolutions will be repeated in the Texas revolutionary experience as well. Okay, so there's a direct connection, okay, between those 3 revolutions, if you will. Okay, so as a general introduction, please be advised that the period between 1600 and 1685, when you look at particularly European history and American history, this is really a time of revolutions. Those centuries, those 250 years or plus years, were really revolutionary, to say the least. Okay, on so many levels. There was just so many different changes, drastic changes in the way people live, in the way people work, in the way people created a government, for example, in the way people studied the universe, what we call science. All of that was changing. There were just revolutions happening all over the place, in the economy, in politics, in the world of religion, in the world of science, and so on. Again, this is what is called the Age of Revolutions. Now, we're not necessarily going to focus on all of the revolutions, just on the ones that had the most direct impact on the Texas Revolution, if you will. Okay? The sort of political revolutions. Okay? Now, during this period of time called the Age of Revolutions, the political revolutions that unfolded during this time were movements that were challenging the old political order. The old political order was called feudalism. Feudalism. Okay. Those revolutions challenged the old feudal order. And if you're asking, so what is feudalism? Okay, what was the old feudal order that was being challenged during those revolutionary upheavals? Well, the old feudal order was a political system that was to a very large degree dominated by three main institutions. And those institutions go back many, many centuries back in time. That is the old feudal order. What are those institutions that we're talking about? Well, on one hand, we're talking about monarchy. Monarchy has been, from the perspective of European history, but also from the perspective of world history, a very ancient institution. It's a very old political institution. Kings or queens governing people, and this was considered normal up to this time. People accepted the fact that there was always, a strong figure called a king, or in some cases a queen as well. That was the person that was actually making all of the decisions for the kingdom, if you will. And people lived in kingdoms, by the way, prior to this time. So we've got monarchy, and the other institution, the other feudal institution, is called an aristocracy. Okay, so what is an aristocracy? Well, the landowners. It was a selected group of people that actually owned the land on behalf of the king, by the way. The king was supposed to be the supreme landowner, the supreme owner of all the kingdom, but he shared certain lands, certain regions of the kingdom with a group of nobles. Again, those were actually noble families that were connected to each other, and they were also connected to the king as well. They share certain familial links, familial connections with one another. Again, that was called the aristocracy. In the other institution that was also old and ancient, was part of this feudal system, is the church. In this case, we're talking about the Catholic Church in Europe, that has been governing pretty much all the religious affairs in Europe ever since its creation in the year 325 AD. So it's very old. Okay, that is the old feudal order that had been pretty much governing Europeans, in this case, for many, many centuries. The monarchy and aristocracy really go back even before the era of Christ, of course. This is the time of kings, the time of monarchs, for example, that Europeans have been living under for more than 2,000 years. Okay, it's a very old system. It's called feudalism. And this is the system that was shaking and crumbling, as we will see again in this part, starting in the 1600s. Now, when we look at some of the characteristics of those institutions and why they're going to be challenged by the 16th, 17th, and 1800s, we can begin to understand how the mindset of those revolutionaries were changing. For example, monarchy, this institution called monarchy, was considered in Europe an institution that was unquestioned. Okay? Nobody questioned the authority of the king. He was the absolute ruler. Okay? This is called absolutism. That is to say, all power was vested on this figure, on this monarch, if you will. People did not question that. They did not even, well, there were some individuals who did question. But the vast majority of the population accepted the authority, the absolute authority of the monarch, because the prevailing belief in Europe was that monarchs received their right to rule from God. Okay? This is known as the divine rights of kings. That's why they enjoy this power and this absolute authority that was unquestioned by the subjects, because the king was simply exercising the will of God. He was, or she, just carrying out the will of the divine. He was placed on earth in order to rule the realm on God's behalf. That is to say, okay, God chose that particular king to be the ruler. That is to say, okay, so power comes from heaven. That is. And again, this is an idea that remained in the minds of Europeans for many, many centuries. We can trace this back to the Romans, by the way, to the Roman Empire. The Roman emperors were considered themselves gods in many cases, or descendants or heirs of the gods. Okay, it's a very old idea. The other institution that I explained a moment ago, aristocracy, once again, this is a group of landowners who have been given certain rights by the king. Now, the king actually shares the land, the wealth of the kingdom with a group of noble families, by the way. And those families are being given land, what is called property, if you will, entitlement. It's not necessarily private property. It's just land rights. Okay, it's really just a document that is sealed and stamped by the king, saying such and such family has been awarded with this territory, so they can oversee it on behalf of the king. That is to say. So they have the right to use the resources of the land, that noble family, and also to extract tribute from the population. In other words, there's going to be people living there in that land, and they're going to pay a certain tax, if you will. That's what a tribute is, to the landowner, to the landlord, as it is called, the landlord, in the form of labor. In many cases, they have to provide labor to the landlord or share some of their products that they produce year by year. If they're farmers, they need to share some of the food with the landlord, and so on and so forth, just to stay on the land. It's a form of tax. It's called tribute. And those entitlements, the entitlement to use the resources of the land and to extract tribute from the population, those are passed on from generation to generation. This is called inheritance. People born into a noble family inherits the rights and the privileges that the family enjoy, the land and the tribute, the wealth that the land produces, and the labor that people produce for you as well. Okay? So again, this is something that is being inherited, this being passed on from generation to generation to generation, unquestioned, okay, for many, many centuries in Europe. The third feudal institution that will be challenged as well in those revolutionary upheavals will be the church. In this case, we're talking about the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in Europe was created in the year 325 AD. And ever since the year 325 all the way to the early 1500s, the Catholic Church enjoyed a virtual religious monopoly. I mean, this is really the only faith that was allowed and accepted in Europe. Okay? The Christian faith, or the Catholic Church, was the dominant and really the only church, if you will, the Church of Rome, that was considered legitimate. Okay, so they enjoyed a monopoly of religious beliefs and practices all the rituals, all the ceremonies that were practiced in Europe have to be conducted by the officials, if you will, of the Catholic Church. And of course, the idea is that in order to contact God, in order to reach the divine, in order to communicate with God, one needed to contact the church first, because the church was in the middle between humans and God. So in order to get to God, you needed to go through the church, that is to say. So that was the kind of monopoly they enjoyed. It was not only that, but the Catholic Church also enjoyed other privileges in Europe, such as being a landowner. Okay? Just like the aristocracy were also landowners, the church was also a very large landowner as well. They own a lot of land. Their land holdings range from anywhere 50 to sometimes 70% of the land holdings of any given kingdom. Sometimes less, sometimes more. Again, but there was a great landholder, if you will, okay, as well. And because they own land in which people live there, the people that lived in the land of the church needed to also pay tribute to the church in the form of taxes or fees, in the form of labor or products, and so on and so forth. So the church was a great tribute collector or tax collector as well. Okay, that's again, those are combined. Monarchy, aristocracy, and the church combined constituted what was considered to be the old feudal order. This is the old feudal order. It's called feudalism. Okay, those are the three governing institutions of feudalism, if you will. In Europe, that will be challenged starting around the 1600s onwards. Those institutions will be questioned and will be challenged through a series of revolutionary movements. Okay, something that we're going to get to assess here, but the Texas Revolution was part of that, if you will. It was a revolution that challenged, in many cases, the same principles of feudalism, whether it was monarchy or aristocracy and the intervention of the church in matters of the state. You know, whenever it wanted to impose a particular faith on the population and the like. The revolutionary upheavals that we're going to get to see in just a few moments here introduce new political principles. The political principles that gave us the world of today, the world of the modern nation state, for example, that most modern nation states today are based on particular principles that were founded, starting back in the 1600s, okay, in this age of revolutions. For example, the new political principles introduced by those movements comprised something called natural rights. It's natural rights. The idea that human beings are born with certain rights. Those rights are given to us by nature or they're given to us by God. But for the first time in human history, people began to started thinking in those terms. Okay? This is the very first time that seriously humans began to think that, well, human beings are sacred creatures that are endowed with certain rights that cannot be taken away. Because those are given to us by nature or they're given to us by the Creator or God, etc. Okay? Those are sacred rights. And those are life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and property. Okay? So this is the very first time in human history that people are thinking in those terms. Okay? Because prior to this time, again, humans just were not really contemplating on those issues. Okay? There were only certain individuals that were sacred. And that was, again, the king, members of the church, like the priests, for example. They were closer to God, and maybe they were the ones that were sacred. But the rest of the population were not. Okay, so it's very important. The other issue is separation of church and state. That's another political principle that is going to be new. People wanted, during those revolutions, the proponents of those revolutions, they wanted to separate the church from the state. In other words, that the state, which is, of course, conceived as a government, for example, need to be concerned with material affairs, the here and the now, this physical world, administering the nation, the finances, the economy, writing laws to create order, and the like. That is the function of the state. And the church needs to be engaged in matters of faith, spirituality, religion, that the church is taking care of this other aspect, separate from the state. That those are two institutions that should be performing different functions and should never be really united. In other words, what people were actually saying is that if church and state remain tied and united, what that means is that in many cases, the church will be in power. Members of the church, like the priests, for example, or bishops, will be the ones running the state. They're going to be the political administrators of the state. And what they're going to do with it? Well, they're going to benefit the church. In what way? Well, gather resources from the people and give it to the church. Or impose a particular faith on the people. It can be the Christian faith, it can be whatever faith. But people should be given the freedom of thought, the freedom of conscience, freedom of religion to choose what they want to believe. And in order to do that, you need to separate the church and the state. You need to keep them separated, in other words. Okay? The other political principle that was also introduced during this time is called political representation. Okay? Political representation. What does that mean? Well, that people, at least the proponents of those principles, those were the leaders of those revolutions, what they were saying is that the best form of government is one by which the people has a say in it, that the people are represented in the government. The interests, the values of the population gets to be represented in the state, that is to say. Okay? The values, the interests, the needs of the population are represented in the state. And also it means that the people choose the representatives as well. Okay? That the representatives are not just there saying, well, God chose me to be your leader or your king, but rather that the people must choose, must elect their own representatives in power. Okay, it's called political representation. So this political principle shifts the idea of divine rights of kings to its head, because what the political philosophers of this time are saying is that power derives from the people. That political power comes from the people, not from God. In other words, that the rulers of any society must be chosen by the people, because it is the people that actually have the power, the real power of the state, that is to say. Okay? So this is revolutionary. It's revolutionary because those ideas were, number one, very new. And two, those ideas were threatening, if you will, the old feudal order. They were threatening the power of the monarchy. They were questioning and threatening the power of the landed aristocracy as well. And they were also threatening the power of the church. So that's why it's revolutionary. Okay, this is not an understatement, but rather this is just the reality. If we can just go back in time, anybody actually talking about those issues was considered, by the standards of the day, a revolutionary. a very radical person, if you will, to be actually just thinking about that. Okay? Now, let's look at the democratic revolutions that were produced during this time that introduced those political principles I just outlined. The political principles of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, the separation of church and state, and political representation, principles that are going to have a great impact in the Texas Revolution, of course. And there are two democratic revolutions in particular that we're going to cover here that had the greatest influence on the Texas Revolution. The first that we're going to cover is the English Civil War. The English Civil War that occurred from 1642 to 1651. Okay, we're talking about the mid 1600s. This is the beginning of the very first democratic revolution, if you will, in world history. Okay, we're talking about now world history. It occurred in England. This is the very first time that people are going to go against their feudal institutions for reasons that we're just going to explain in a few moments here. All right, so let's talk about the background. In other words, how this democratic revolution originated initially in England. Well, first, this revolution originated originally out of a religious revolution that had occurred back in the 1500s. So this is like an old issue, if you will, that is really boiling up and re-emerging in the mid-1600s, an issue that goes back to the 1500s, and that is the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, again, was a religious revolution against the Catholic Church. We're not going to actually cover all of the issues surrounding the Protestant Reformation, just the essentials. What happened is that in 1517 to 1519, there were individuals within the Catholic Church. In many cases, those were actually Catholic professors and university professors like Martin Luther, something we discussed, of course, earlier in an earlier topic, that questioned some of the doctrines of the Catholic Church. Okay, they really questioned the activities of the church, what the church was doing in the economy and politics, that it was becoming an institution so much centered on worldly affairs in many cases, and that it had forgotten the original doctrine of Christianity. What happened is that out of those questionings, the Catholic Church is going to lose its monopoly. Okay? The Catholic Church will no longer be the only dominant church in Europe. There will be about 50% of Europeans now leaving the Catholic Church in protest. And what they wanted was to reform the Christian church. So they became the Protestants, if you will. They're still Christians, but they call themselves Protestants. They protest what the Catholic Church is teaching, and they are offering an alternative version of Christianity, a reformed version of Christianity, if you will. So it was considered revolutionary, of course. Now, in particular, what we're talking about here is that the Protestants who left the Catholic Church wanted to remove all of the bureaucracy of the church. In other words, all of the personnel that the Catholic Church maintained for many centuries, what is called the church hierarchy, is an organization. It's like a hierarchy. It's like a pyramid. It's an organization of functionaries and administrators. Down in the very bottom of the hierarchy, you find the priests, for example, and above the priests, you find the bishops, and above the bishops, the archbishops, and then above the archbishops, the cardinals, and then on the very top, the pope, and so on. And the Pope was considered pretty much like the leader of the church. So whatever pronouncement the Pope had, all of the other members of the church, of the hierarchy, of the church hierarchy, had to obey. In other words, well, the Protestants want to remove all of that. Okay, they want a church to be more democratic. That is to say, okay. So this is one of the very first times when the word democracy, or the idea of democracy, is going to be introduced in the minds of Europeans. And it all happened in the context of religion, inside of what was called Protestantism. Okay? The Protestant churches were created more democratically. Not perfect, but you're not going to have that rigid structure, if you will, in which there's a leader on top making all of the decisions for everybody to follow and unquestioned and all that. What the Protestant wanted is that they wanted to control their own churches, that the people, that the congregation itself will be in control of the church, and that they will choose their pastor or minister to be their leader, in other words. Okay, so the idea of democracy, that the power rests on the people and that people choose their representatives. This is happening inside of the Protestant churches. So many of the ministers of those Protestant churches are being elected, if you will, by the congregation to be the pastor. And also, they wanted to be in control of the teachings as well. Those Protestant churches also wanted to study the Bible, and after reading the Bible, actually determine what the Bible actually said. That's what's called, again, be in control of the doctrine, what the church is going to be teaching. They wanted that kind of right, okay? The right to actually be in charge of their own content, of their own teachings as well. What Protestantism actually pursued was a sense of religious independence and freedom, okay? They felt that before the Protestant Revolution, everybody was at the mercy, if you will, of the church authorities. Okay, so what the Bible actually said on this particular book, or what the teachings of Christ had to say, and so on. Well, the church was the ultimate authority on those issues, and it was unquestioned. Okay. Now Protestants are breaking away from that authority, and they're feeling now a sense of what is called religious independence and freedom, that is to say. So this is where the spirit, if you will, of democracy begins. It begins in the Protestant Reformation. People are beginning to feel that, look, one of the strongest and most dominant institutions of Europe, the church, has been challenged and is now being broken. The Catholic Church lost its monopoly as millions of Europeans just fled the church, of course. So people gain the sense that those institutions are subject to disintegration. They're not eternal. They're not here to stay forever, in other words, unchallenged, but they have limitations. They have weaknesses, in other words. And people are reclaiming back their authority or power to decide what they want to believe in, how they're going to interpret the teachings of Christ or the Bible and so on. And they want to be in control of their own churches as well. Now, of course, the Protestant Reformation uh, arrives to England in the 1530s. It is around 1532 that England goes Protestant. Okay, the King of England, King Henry VIII, breaks away from the Church of Rome, from the Catholic Church for personal reasons, had nothing to do with issues of doctrine or interpretation of the Bible or anything like that. He wanted to get a divorce. He couldn't under the Catholic Church, so he renounced the Catholic faith. He broke away from the Church of Rome. He went, quote unquote, Protestant, and created his own church in England called the Anglican Church. And he was the head of the church, by the way. Problem is, this new church that was considered to be Protestant was identical to the Catholic Church. The only thing that changed was the name. In other words, and we're going to get to that point, of course, in just a few moments. But at least on the surface, England goes Protestant, in the 1530s. Okay, it's supposed to be now a Protestant kingdom. So there is a lot of, if you will, expectations within English society that the times were changing in England, and suddenly Protestant ideas can be welcome, and we're going to see the rise of a more Protestant faith, Christian faith in England. That was at least the expectation. We're going to get to see again how this is going to be problematic, again, just in a few moments. Now, another thing we see unfolding in England that will be also leading up to this English Civil War was the rise of capitalism. So there's also an economic revolution taking place in England, okay? An economic revolution that is ending the old feudal order in which landlords are simply collecting rents and tribute from the population. That kind of economic system is going to also be altered with the rise of capitalism. Okay? It was really revolutionary, capitalism, during that time. Now, how capitalism flourished in England? Well, capitalism flourished as a result of the growth and expansion of a new social group or social class known as the merchant class. This merchant class begins to expand and grow in England in the 1600s. This is also, again, very, very important for the kind of changes that we're going to see not only in the English Civil War, but also in the American Revolution and in the Texas Revolution, as you'll see. This merchant class was growing and expanding as a result of international trade. Again, we see the rise of international trade, something we discussed in an earlier topic, starting around the 1300s. From the 13th to the 1600s, this is the time in world history in which we see the rise of a global economic system, if you will. There is, again, international trade taking place in which the different civilizations in the different continents of the world are meeting for the first time, and there is commercial exchange taking place back and forth of material goods. That commercial exchange, this international trade that is taking place in those centuries, gave rise to the merchant class, not only in England, but in many kingdoms of Europe and around the world at large. Okay? International trade. Because there are people, particularly merchants, who are very interested in that trade, and they're going to participate in it. They're going to venture into other lands in order to bring foreign goods, exotic, luxurious commodities that they can actually commercialize with in their own cities or in their own towns, in their own kingdoms. There are those that participate in what is called investment. They invest in ventures as well. They form companies like joint stock companies. This is the modern version of what a company is. You associate yourself with other merchants, you put money together, and you form a company, and you all share expenses, risks, profits, and the like in trading operations. There are some merchants that invest in shipping operations as well. You build a ship or two, those are cargo ships to build merchandise, and you charge for transportation costs and so on. It's called shipping services, for example. That's another, again, type of industry that is on the rise, and that involves, of course, investors, merchants who are participating in this. There are some merchants that actually invest in what is called commercial agriculture. They realize that towns are growing, cities are growing, and they need to be fed, so they start using the land in a different way. They start growing cash crops. They want to use the land to make money. Okay? Grow cash crops, grow things like wheat, for example, or vegetables and the like, and sell that food in the cities, and you make money. So you become an entrepreneur, if you will. You're not just a landlord that is collecting rents from people, but you are indeed engaged in a commercial venture in agriculture. There are those who use the land to produce wool. They clear the land, they move sheep in there, and by grazing the sheep there, they're actually able to produce wool, which is being used to weave, of course, clothing and so on, all of that, okay, as well. So we see the rise of a market economy. People are now moving to the market. They want to produce something that they can sell and make money from, in other words. So this is the time when people are thinking about wealth creation or wealth generation, investing in some form of business venture or some enterprise of some kind in order to make money, in other words. Okay, it's very important. So this is what's really the beginnings of capitalism, if you will. In England, we're also going to see the formation of international trading companies. Those are large companies that, for the most part, operate overseas. Okay, like for example, the British East India Company that was founded in 1600. This is a company that operated in India, okay, to bring spices to Britain. Okay, spices in the spice trade, for example. The London and Plymouth companies that were formed in England, but to operate on North America, to produce things like tobacco and export furs as well in the fur trade, for example. Okay, so we see the formation of what today simply we call corporations, for example. Back in England during this time, that are operating overseas. That is to say, and they have those companies and corporations legal charters. In other words, those are legal entities. They have the legal permission or legal permits by the King of England to operate in different parts of the world on behalf of the king. Okay, on behalf of the king, they have an obligation to trade with England, to be producing products overseas in order to benefit the mother country, in this case England. Again, so this is the rise of what is called capitalism and the formation of a large merchant class, in other words. Many of those companies and entrepreneurs are now entering the era of what is called contract relationships. You sign a contract with another business person, another investor, with a company and so on, and you're bound to obey the terms of the contract. Again, so people are now guided, they're abiding by legal contracts as well. Okay, so this is giving rise to a whole new economy, a whole new society based on commercial exchange, wealth generation, for example. Okay, it's very important. People are pursuing now, money, and they want to make money, in other words. Okay. Now, The problem, despite the fact that there's of course significant change taking place in England with the rise of the merchant class and all those commercial activities that are producing more and more merchants and entrepreneurs and making money and so on, is that there's still the absence of private property rights. In other words, that the monarch or the king still is the owner of everything that is contained within the kingdom. So all the land, all the enterprises, even the ships that those merchants and entrepreneurs are creating, all those enterprises are considered the property of the king. They're not really the property of those individuals ultimately. Yeah, those individuals can actually operate them and use them for gain and everything else. But at any time, whenever the king decides to seize some of those properties, the king can actually do that. Because remember, this is an institution that is unquestioned. People really believe that kings are absolute rulers, that their power comes from God. Okay? And that is going to be problematic. We have the rise of a merchant class is growing in numbers, and they have economic power. And they're now confronted with a monarch that is becoming more and more old-fashioned. A monarch that does not recognize the rights of individuals. A monarch that does not recognize the rights of the merchant class and their property rights. Particularly a monarch that behaves very anti-democratically. Okay? And that's going to be the third issue that led to the English Civil War, is that we got an absolute monarchy, a monarch who is going against the interest of its own subjects and denying them any voice, any participation, and any rights, if you will. He's not really taking them into account, because this monarch, in this case we're talking about King Charles I, believes himself to be an absolute ruler who received his right to rule from God. He's a firm believer in the divine rights of kings. So he doesn't need to consult with anybody to write a law or pass a tax, or whenever he wants to seize property, he doesn't really need to take anybody into account. He doesn't need the opinion, the approval of anybody, because he's just carrying out the will of God, in other words. Okay? That is, again, problematic. King Charles, in the 1630s, late 1630s, was facing a rebellion in one part of the kingdom. He wanted to put down the rebellion, so he needed money. And he looked around and said, well, where am I going to get the money from? Well, I see that there's a group of people here very successful. Those are the merchants. They're having enormous successes with their international trading operations. So I'm just going to actually tax them. Okay, I'm going to tax the merchants. They have the economic resources that I need. So I will tax them, and I'm not going to actually request any vote of any kind. I'm just simply going to pass those laws, and they need to pay those taxes. So he taxed the merchants without representation. The merchants are not being asked what they think about the taxes, or if they agree with it or negotiate. Of course, there will be a reaction. The merchants reacted to the policies of King Charles and said, well, this is unjust. What are you doing? You're taxing us without representation. And so what he did, King Charles, was to send some of those merchants to jail. Some of them were actually executed. He actually provided the death penalty. And in some other instances, he confiscated their property. So we see certain violations: life, liberty, and property. Okay? When you execute, of course, a merchant, you're depriving them of their life. When you send them to prison, you're depriving them of their liberty. When you're confiscating or seizing some of their assets and properties, you're violating their property rights, life, liberty, and property. Okay? And this is exactly, again, what is going to lead to those issues. The idea that, wait a minute, we do have certain rights. This is what the merchants will be saying. Again, something I will explain just shortly. That the merchants are going to be really thinking about, we do have rights. We are human. And by nature, we have the right to life, liberty, and property. Of course, this is coming from this experience. Now, King Charles is also a Catholic king in a Protestant country. England, at least English society, is Protestant, but the ruler is Catholic. And of course, he's trying to impose Catholicism on the people. And he opposes all kinds of changes in the church. He opposes Protestant reforms. He doesn't want to reform the Church of England so the Church of England can look more Protestant. He wants to keep it as Catholic as possible, in other words. He wants the Church of England, as a matter of fact, to return to its proper place, he said, to be Catholic again, to be in good terms with the Church of Rome. He wants to preserve the administration of the Catholic Church in England, the preservation of the church hierarchy with the priests and bishops and archbishops, cardinals and everything else. He wants that. And he wants to preserve also the land holdings of the church. He doesn't want any change to take place for the Church of England. He wants the Church of England again to remain a large landholder or landowner, okay, in England. And people don't want that. People want change now. There's a democratic spirit in England. People are calling for change. They want their rights respected, and they want the king to leave the church alone. In other words, they want the church to be more democratic, that the people should be in charge of their own churches, not that the church should be in control of the king or in control of the Pope in Rome, in other words. Okay? King Charles I unleashes then a persecution of Puritans. In other words, the greatest critics of King Charles were the Puritans. Those are Protestants that wanted the Church of England to become more Protestant, and the Puritans are persecuted, okay, severely by King Charles. And of course, this leads to the Great Rebellion. The Great Rebellion begins. There's going to be an alliance of merchants, farmers who wanted to stop paying tribute, farmers who wanted to stop paying taxes to the church or to the aristocracy. They wanted to be in control of their own lands. And of course, the Puritans themselves, this religious group, is going to ally with the merchants and the farmers to contest the old feudal order. They're contesting the monarchy and the church and the aristocracy as well. What the merchants do is that they seize control of Parliament. Okay, there is this legislative body, like what we today we call a Congress, for example. And in England, the Parliament was the domain of the landowners. The landowners dominated the Parliament. But by this time, it is the merchants who ultimately seize control of Parliament and says now Parliament should be the supreme authority of England, not the monarchy. We want England to have a diminished monarchy, and instead that the government of England should be a parliament, okay, a parliament, and that parliament should represent the interests of the population, okay. It's called a representative form of government, in other words. We want to shift power back, if you will, to at least certain groups of people the merchants are not thinking to empowering everybody in England, but they want to take away the power from the king, invested that power now in Congress, of course. And so the Civil War breaks out. Again, this is a war that was fought, if you want to really create a simplistic visual of the English Civil War, it was a war between the monarchy and Parliament. And remember, Parliament is in control of the merchants. So in reality, what the Civil War was, it was a war waged by the merchants against the king, okay, because the king was violating their rights. It was also, this English Civil War, a war in which the old feudal order, represented by the monarchy, aristocracy, and the church, was being challenged by the new forces of capitalism. Okay, there's a new economic system on the rise, if you will, that is saying, well, this is the way we should govern England. People should be allowed to own property. We should allow individuals to create enterprises to make money. This is the way to do it. And this new capitalist system is trying to displace the old system of the past, in which a group of people own all of the land and simply are just collecting tribute from the population. They're not really making money. They're not making the land more productive. They're just collecting rents, in other words. So again, this is also a war of capitalism against feudalism. Another way to look at it is that the English Civil War was also a war between Catholics and Protestants. Okay, those who sided with the monarch were the Catholics, and those who sided with Parliament were actually Protestants as well. Okay, that wanted religious independence and religious freedom as well. Okay. Ultimately, what happened is that the King of England, King Charles I, will be executed. The conservative forces, the old feudal order, lost in the English Civil War, and the King of England will be executed again in 1649. Again, this is the very first, if you will, democratic revolution in which the king loses the battle and is executed, if you will. Okay? The aftermath. What is the aftermath? Well, even though after the execution of King Charles I, the heirs of King Charles tried to come back and reinstate the monarchy in England, after several attempts to reinstate the monarchy, finally in 1689, the forces of Parliament won the day. Okay? Parliament emerges triumphantly in 1689, and something called the Glorious Revolution. Finally, the forces of Parliament win, ultimately, all of the struggle, and they're able to form a new system of government in England. It's called a parliamentary system of government, like a Congress. Again, this is a representative form of government in which the members of Parliament are supposed to represent the different localities, the different towns, and different cities of England. Okay? We see the introduction of a new constitution, a Bill of Rights, in which citizens are informed of their rights, that those are the rights of citizens, if you will. And of course, one of those central rights of the English Bill of Rights is the rights to property. Okay? And kind of really solidifies, if you will, the beginning of capitalism in England. Because capitalism, one of the central pillars of capitalism is private property. Okay? So this is one of the central pillars of capitalism, is the right of citizens to own property rights. Okay? And also religious independence, that there's going to be a separation of church and state, and the people of England will be given religious freedom, if you will. Okay? Now, we also see, after the English Civil War, the birth of liberal ideas. One of the outcomes of the English Civil War is that it gave really birth to a series of new ideas about liberty. That's what we mean about liberal ideas. Ideas about liberty, human liberty, that is to say. This occurred in about 100-year period from 1680 to 1780s or thereabouts, again, in a period known as the Enlightenment in England. Not in England, in Europe, that is to say. Okay, this happened all over Europe, not only in England. All over Europe. We're going to see intellectuals or philosophers, as they were called, formulating new political ideas, the ideas that gave us the modern world, the world that we live in today, the political ideas that we take for granted. Okay? In particular, we're just going to look at two, the most important ones that will have the greatest impact in the American Revolution, but also in the Texas Revolution. That is the ideas of natural rights on one hand, but also the ideas of the consent of the governed on the other. Okay? There are two main ideas that were considered liberal, based on liberty, that is to say, that are going to become foundational for the rise not only of new revolutions, but also of new forms of government in the future. The British philosopher John Locke in the 1680s and 90s was the one who formulated the ideas of natural rights philosophy. He himself was a merchant, and he was very aware of the English Civil War and how King Charles violated the rights of the merchants when he imprisoned them or sentenced them to death or seized their property. So he said, look, I'm hereby actually formulating, this is not just an idea, he said, this is what he termed to be reality, the truth, and that is that humans are born with certain rights given to us by nature, and those are the rights to life, liberty, and property. And in fact, what John Locke is suggesting is that life, liberty, and property are the three main duties of government to protect. In other words, what is the reason for any government to exist, he said? Well, government should exist for the sole reason of protecting life, liberty, and property. So for him, this is foundational. In other words, whenever we're thinking about forming a new government, well, you need to take into account that this is the main duty of a government: life, liberty, and property. He also talks about freedom of conscience, the freedom of thought. In other words, what's called religious freedom, the freedom for people to think or believe whatever they want. This freedom of conscience. What he's actually referring here is that the ideal state is one in which church and state are totally separated, okay? Not united, but rather separated as well, to allow individuals to enjoy freedom of conscience. The other philosopher of the Enlightenment that also produced another fundamental idea about human liberty was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a French philosopher who lived in the mid-1700s in Paris, who developed the idea about the consent of the governed, that for any government to be legitimate, to have the legitimate right to rule, it required the consent, the approval of the people. In other words, that this is the ideal form of government, a government that has its approval or consent of the people that it governs. Okay? He wrote that idea in a book called The Social Contract. Again, he actually titled this book The Social Contract. That there's a contract between the government and the people. And the contract is that, well, yes, he said, Government should protect life, liberty, and property. Those are the three main duties of government. But the other part of the bargain is that people need to be also approving or consenting their government as well. So, in this book called The Social Contract, he outlines in very general terms the two main requirements for an ideal form of government in which there's a social contract, a bond, a covenant between the government and the people. And that is that you need to set up a system of political representation. In other words, the ideal government is one in which people are going to be represented in the state, whether it's in an assembly, a parliament, or a congress. Again, it doesn't matter. You can choose whether you want to call it an assembly, a parliament, or a congress. When you have that, and the members of Congress come from the different localities, from the different parts of the realm, then you're fulfilling the requirements for the perfect form of government. Okay? And also, number two is that people should be electing their representatives. You need a system of elections, in other words. And the citizens must have the right to elect their leaders and rulers, what we call today elections, in other words. Okay? That's very important. You know, those two ideas will be widely read in North America, and they're going to have a great impact in the thinking of the British colonists, in how they're going to be thinking about their relationship to the British government. Okay? Which leads us again to the American Revolution of 1776. This is the second democratic revolution that is directly connected to the English Civil War, and that will have a direct impact in the Texas Revolution. They're totally connected, the three of them: the English Civil War, the American Revolution, and the Texas Revolution. Now, very quickly, the background. Again, this is, we start with, of course, 13 colonies established by England, or Great Britain for that matter. Colonies that were actually charter companies. This is very important, that the 13 colonies of North America that became the United States originally were actually companies. Those were actually companies that were created by private merchants and investors who received a legal permit from the king to operate on North America on behalf of England. Those were companies. Yes, it's true, they can also be called colonies because ultimately British people came over to colonize them and settle, of course, in this part of North America. But they functioned as companies. Actually, they were owned by a series of investors or merchants to actually produce products for the British Empire, that is to say. Okay? Those were actually joint stock companies again. Like Virginia was called Virginia Stock Company. Massachusetts was called Massachusetts Bay Company or Plymouth Company. Those were actually companies, by the way. Okay? And those companies received land grants from the king. The king actually gave land to those companies so they could actually develop into different kinds of enterprises, plantations or cattle ranches and towns and the like. Okay? Those were legal entities, that is to say, from the perspective of England, that is. Now, those companies were granted also a certain degree of self-rule, what is called autonomy. Autonomy is self-rule. They were self-governed in many cases. That the colonists, the people living in those companies or colonies, were in control of their own towns. Okay? They form assemblies, what is called a colonial assembly, like a city council, if you will. And in many cases, they voted or chose the members of the colonial assemblies. They were self-governed. Those were not actually assemblies that were formed by the British in London, and then all policy was dictated from London directly. The colonies were kind of governing themselves, if you will. The only issue is that there was no real representation in Parliament. That is to say, the colonists did not send delegates to London to sit in the British Parliament to represent the interests of the colonies. That is going to be a problem, again, as we'll see later on. They were self-governed, but at the same time, the downside is that the colonies did not have any representatives in the British Parliament. That's another thing. Two, we see the rise of colonial merchants and wealthy planters in the colonies. Just as we saw the rise of a merchant class in England, remember we talked about international trade, the formation of trading companies and commercial agriculture, investor class and the like, with the rise of a merchant class in England prior to the English Civil War. Well, before the American Revolution, something very similar happened. In that in the 13 colonies, we see also a growing group of colonial merchants and very wealthy plantation owners who were doing very well here in North America by engaging in trade, importing products from different parts of Europe or from different parts of the world and selling them to the colonists, or exporting things like tobacco and rice, not only to England, but also to France and Holland as well. Again, they were really, engaged in what is called a free trade system. Trade was not really regulated in the very beginning. It was a not regulated trade system, that the colonies kind of enjoyed. They were pretty much operating on their own, at least during the first phase of development. Okay. We also see the rise of independent farmers in the colonies. The yeoman farmer, that is the farmer that owns his, or in this case, during this time, still males were the only ones allowed to own property. So the yeoman farmer was the farmer that owned and controlled his own land. And there was, of course, the growth of this group, and they were trying to move westward in pursuit of more farmland. As the population of the colonies grew, more and more land became exhausted, less and less economic opportunities for the farmers, and they started looking westward. They said, well, there's all the land that we need is westward, we just need to move there, and so on again. So we're going to see also this group feeling kind of anxious at the fact that there's overpopulation, land shortages, but available land to the west. They're willing and very, very motivated to actually move westward in pursuit of land. So there are three, of course, groups growing in the colonies: the merchants, the wealthy planters, and the farmers, who are pretty much each operating in their own sphere, if you will, individually, doing relatively well. Now, the problem is that by the 1760s, the British are going to change their policies towards the 13 colonies, and they're trying to control more and more the political and economic destinies of the colonies. Again, so we see the beginning of what is called British anti-democratic rule. The British are now trying to regulate and govern the colonies more directly and tax their trade, and even regulate and even control their trade as well. Okay? All of this is going to happen without actual representation. In other words, the British are not going to ask the colonies what they think about the new policies, whether they're taxation or trade regulation. They're not going to ask them anything. They're simply going to pass those laws. uh, undemocratically, if you will. Okay, they're restricting their free trade. Colonial merchants are now facing a lot of restrictions after the 1760s, when the British Parliament passed something called the Navigation Laws of the 1760s, otherwise known as the American Revenue Acts. The British are trying to raise revenues from the British colonies in North America, tax them in order to increase their revenues, in other words, for the British Empire. And most of those taxes will be falling very, very heavily on the merchant class. And the activities of the merchants in terms of their trading operations will be curtailed as well. They're also, British Parliament, closing the frontier for landless colonists. In other words, there's a lot of colonies that do not own land. Remember, they want more farmlands. But the British in 1763 announced, under the British Proclamation Act of 1763, that the colonists can no longer migrate westward. The British declare that all lands of the west of the colonies, belong to the Native Americans. And the colonists have no right of actually moving there. Okay? So this is going to put another pressure on the farmers, if you will. Farmers are going to be exasperated that, look, we are desperate for land, and now you have prohibited us from actually migrating westward. We also see from 1773 to 1775 a series of laws that the British passed to actually punish Massachusetts colony. And this is, again, a series of laws not known as the Coercive Acts. Again, this is something that the British passed to punish Massachusetts for dumping black tea on the Boston Harbor in 1773. This was known as the Boston Tea Party. Okay, the British passed the Tea Act of 1773, which gave one company, the East India Company, again, a monopoly on the tea trade, denying the colonists any participation on the tea trade also altogether, displacing the wealthy merchants from Massachusetts. And of course, in Boston, people actually went against East India Company and pretty much destroyed the cargo of 3 ships. Again, this is black tea. Again, pretty much destroyed it. Okay, and so the coercive acts were done to punish Massachusetts. They were known as the Intolerable Acts. It revoked the Massachusetts Bay Company charter. In other words, it told this company called Massachusetts Bay Company, you will no longer be a private company. From now on, Massachusetts is going to be a company owned by the King of England, a royal charter owned by the king. Imagine. So all the colonial assemblies of Massachusetts were abolished. Now the people of Massachusetts will not have a say in their own political affairs. All appointments will be made by the King of England. The King of England will be making all appointments for Massachusetts colony. So again, this is really the end for Massachusetts of self-rule on one hand, but also the loss of entitlements and rights as well. Okay, so this led to the American Declaration of Independence. Obviously, the colonists see that this was a direct violation of natural rights. Remember, this is a group of merchants who are very well read in the ideas of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and they're very well read about the English Civil War, what happened in the English Civil War. So what they're saying is that this is happening to us now. We got a British Parliament and a monarch that are violating the rights of the colonists. They're imposing taxation without representation, without consent. In other words, the colonies are not voting on those taxes. We're just simply being taxed. And revoking a charter, a private company owned by a series of private investors, is really seizing or confiscating property. This is now the colony of a king. This is a violation of property rights. You're abolishing our colonial assemblies and governments. You know, we're no longer in control of our own colony, in other words, here in Massachusetts. So again, the colonies get together declare independence, and they're going to struggle for independence, of course. There's going to be an alliance of merchants, planters, and farmers who are going to be fighting for certain objectives like property rights, free trade, land settlement in the West, but also self-rule as well. Again, so there's going to be an alliance. Again, this is not just one group of people, but rather an alliance of merchants, planters, and farmers, pretty much fighting for what they believe to be their rights, if you will, their natural rights. So the aftermath, rather quickly, is that we see the formation, of course, of American Republic. After independence was won, the colonies now create a new country called the United States. It's a republic in 1787, and it has a representative form of government in which people are going to be electing their representatives in office at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. Again, people are going to be voting their mayors into office, or their governors into office, their president, congressmen, and so on in office. It's a representative form of government. And of course, we have a Bill of Rights, the rights of citizens, in which the Bill of Rights, of course, is a document that clearly states the rights of citizens of life, liberty, and property, particularly property and contracts, how property and contracts are sacred in the U.S. Constitution. And there's a clear separation, of course, of church and state, okay, in the U.S. Constitution. Okay, so in sum, what we have learned in part one, the Texas Revolution and the Age of Revolution, is, again, that we see, for example, several revolutionary movements taking place in that 250-year period starting in the 1600s. We see, for example, the rise of capitalism, the rise of the merchant class with the idea of private property. They introduced the idea of private property. We see the rise of the Protestant Reformation, this religious revolution that introduced the idea of democratic control of churches and doctrine. We also saw the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of natural rights, of life, liberty, and property, and the consent of the governed. That people need to consent and approve of their government, in other words. And also we looked at some of the democratic revolutions, like the English Civil War and the American Revolution, in which we see the introduction of new political systems of representation, like a parliament or Congress, for example. We see the introduction of constitutional rights, like a Bill of Rights that clearly state the rights of citizens, like life, liberty, and property, and a separation of church and state. Okay, so this is what we have seen so far in part one. Now, we're not moving into part two. This is going to be reserved for session two, but this is as far as we're going to go for session one. We just covered pretty much, if you will, just the historical background of the Texas Revolution, where the Texas Revolution is going to get its inspiration from. All of the ideas that we just discussed are going to be now reenacted, repeated, if you will, in the Texas revolutionary experience. Something we're going to get to see in session two when we come back. Thank you.